Did you know that one mistake could cost millions of lives? In this story, the USA decided the fate of the war in just a few days. If you're interested in the truth about World War II, subscribe and hit the like button. There are many shocking facts ahead. December 15th, 1944, Schmidheim, Germany. Imagine standing on the frozen soil of a sleeping German village where the very ground hums with anticipation. The steel thunder of panzer columns shatters the stillness as they rumble westward under cover of night, a seemingly endless stream of armor vanishing into the shadowy embrace of the Eiffel forest. Inside the rear of a half-track, Obergefreiter Hans Müller watches in silence, breath-forming clouds in the frigid air, his thoughts far from the frost-bitten steel around him. Tomorrow was the day. The moment everything would change. Germany, cornered and desperate, was about to hurl one last strike to turn the tide, one final chance to prove to the world, and perhaps to itself, that victory was still within reach. Müller's fingers, stiff with cold, hovered uncertainly over his diary. Each word he penned was a risk, a whisper of doubt that, if discovered, could cost him his life. They say this attack will split the Allies and force them to the table. I want to believe. God, I want to believe. But I've seen the firestorms from above, watched our cities consumed, and now we march into Belgium with barely enough fuel to reach the Meuse. Antwerp? It feels like a fantasy. The ink bled onto the page, a confession of silent dread shared by many, though few dared admit it aloud. For every soldier on that front knew the unspoken truth. The numbers didn't add up. Across a 75-mile stretch from Monschau to Echternach, more than 200,000 German troops braced for what Adolf Hitler had dramatically named Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, Operation Watch on the Rhine, a title chosen not for clarity, but for camouflage, suggesting a defensive stand rather than what it truly was, a last-ditch offensive, a gambler's throw in the dying winter of the war. And what a gamble it was. The plan bordered on the fantastical. 3 armies would surge through the sparsely defended American lines in the dense Ardennes, race across the Meuse River, and storm 100 miles onward to seize Antwerp. If successful, it would cleave the Allied forces in two, the British to the north, the Americans to the south, forcing the West into peace talks. This, in turn, would free up Germany's dwindling resources to focus entirely on the unstoppable Soviet tide pouring in from the east. The generals who first heard the scheme in November sat stunned. They didn't see a bold masterstroke. They saw delusion. Hitler had crafted the entire operation himself, swatting away opposition from seasoned commanders like Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and Field Marshal Walter Model, accusing them of cowardice cloaked as reason. One man in particular, General of Armored Troops Hasso von Manteuffel, listened with mounting unease. He was no stranger to the brutal arithmetic of war, having carved out victories against the Soviets through sheer tactical brilliance and mechanized finesse. Now, as commander of the 5th Panzer Army, he saw clearly what others perhaps refused to see. Germany no longer had the means to carry out such a vision. In a private audience with Hitler on December 2nd, Manteuffel dared to voice his doubts. Success, he argued, hinged on several fragile factors: total surprise, weather severe enough to ground Allied air superiority, a lightning-quick advance, and, most crucially, the capture of Allied fuel supplies. Without these stars aligning perfectly, the offensive would grind to a halt before it ever saw Antwerp. But Hitler would not hear it. With a dismissive wave, he brushed aside these concerns, clinging to the belief that German willpower alone, that intangible fire of spirit, would triumph over material scarcity. Yet no amount of will could drive a Tiger tank without gasoline. No fervent loyalty could conjure shells from thin air. The Wehrmacht was about to gamble its last strategic reserve, a colossal commitment of men and machines on an operation whose chance of success hovered around a dismal 10%. The forces assigned to Wacht am Rhein represented the last flicker of Germany's offensive might. In the north, the 6th Panzer Army, led by SS Obergruppenführer Joseph Sepp Dietrich, was tasked with delivering the decisive blow, slicing past Liège on the way to Antwerp. Dietrich, though commanding the Reich's strongest armored formation, was hardly the man for such a responsibility. A product of Hitler's inner circle, elevated more for loyalty than strategic talent, Dietrich had never displayed the operational insight required for such a complex endeavor. Rundstedt called him decent but stupid, and Model had resisted his appointment in vain. Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army would spearhead the central thrust, pushing toward Bastogne and Namur before pivoting north to link with Dietrich. Meanwhile, to the south, General Erich Brandenberger's 7th Army would protect the offensive's flank, though his mostly infantry forces lacked the speed and firepower to do more than delay inevitable American counterattacks. On paper, the figures inspired awe. Over 400,000 troops would be involved in various phases of the operation. Around 1,400 tanks and assault guns, 2,600 artillery pieces, and 1,000 aircraft had been scraped together from the farthest corners of the shrinking Reich. But these numbers were a mirage. Many of the 30 divisions designated for the assault were shadows of their former selves, newly rebuilt, hastily filled with teenage boys and middle-aged men barely trained for combat. The Panzer divisions, although boasting deadly Tigers and Panthers, lacked the essentials: enough support vehicles, maintenance capabilities, and above all, fuel. Military planners quietly calculated that the armored columns had fuel for perhaps 30, maybe 40 miles of advance. After that, silence. So now imagine yourself among them, cold, uncertain, but ordered to believe. You stand at the edge of a forest thick with snow and secrets waiting for dawn. The drums of war beat once more in the Ardennes, and Germany holds its breath. The thin thread of hope. Now picture this: a column of steel snakes westward through the misty stillness of the Ardennes, its destination shimmering like a mirage on the horizon, the Meuse River, 80 miles away. Antwerp, a daunting 125 miles from where the 1st Panzers now roared to life. The fate of an entire army, perhaps of the entire Reich, depended on what would happen in the first crucial hours, not on brute strength, not on numbers, but on gasoline, liquid gold that could not be manufactured by courage. The German High Command had placed its hopes on a single, fragile gamble, that the Americans, caught by surprise, would leave their fuel depots intact, that in their retreat they would abandon the very lifeblood the Panzer spearhead needed to survive. If they torched it, and they likely would, the German assault would stall, surrounded and strangled deep in enemy territory. But for now, the mask had held. Deception had worked like a charm. Total radio silence, movement only under the cover of darkness. And a code name, Wacht am Rhein, that whispered of defense, not attack. Allied intelligence saw only shadows. American generals were convinced Germany had neither the strength nor the desperation to attempt such an offensive. The Ardennes front was guarded by just 4 divisions, understrength, exhausted, or green. Soldiers stationed there had nicknamed it the Ghost Front, a place of eerie calm where nothing ever happened. That illusion shattered with the thunder of dawn. Fire in the fog, December 16, 1944. At exactly 5:30 a.m., the icy quiet of the Ardennes was obliterated. The ground shook as 1,600 German artillery pieces unleashed a ferocious 90-minute bombardment, tearing through the trees and snow like a storm of steel. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann, commanding a Panzer IV in the 2nd Panzer Division, had felt the wrath of Soviet guns on the Eastern Front. And though this barrage paled in comparison, the devastation it wrought upon the unsuspecting Americans filled him with a grim satisfaction. Maybe, just maybe, surprise and firepower could carry the day. His tank groaned into motion. Infantry surged forward like waves against a weakening shore. Behind him, the forest echoed with the deep growl of engines as dozens of tanks advanced into Belgium under a veil of mist. In the turret, Zimmermann glanced at the fuel gauge. 3/4 full, enough to reach the Meuse, if all went perfectly if, a single syllable carrying the weight of destiny. A bottleneck at the spearhead. But already in the north, cracks were forming. The 6th Panzer Army's advance stumbled almost immediately. At the village of Lanzerath, a mere reconnaissance platoon of American soldiers, aided by artillery spotters, managed to delay an entire German paratrooper battalion for an astounding 10 hours. 10 hours, a lifetime in the race against time. When night fell, SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, commander of Kampfgruppe Peiper, the most elite armored unit of the 6th Army, arrived to find his path still blocked. Peiper, just 29 years old, had once served as Heinrich Himmler's adjutant. He was the very image of the Nazi war machine, tall, ruthless, fiercely loyal to the SS. And now he held in his hands the most critical task of the entire offensive: to spearhead the charge, punch through the American lines, seize key bridges before they could be destroyed, and drive west without delay. Infuriated by the holdup, Peiper pushed forward at midnight, personally leading his column through the dark and twisting roads of the Ardennes. By now, he was already 6 hours behind schedule, and American defenses had yet to truly crack. At Hansfeld, however, fortune smiled. Peiper's tanks rolled over a sleeping American position, capturing scores of vehicles, stockpiles of fuel, and hundreds of stunned prisoners. It was a tactical windfall. Pausing only long enough to siphon precious gasoline from the captured supplies, Peiper pressed on, his armored serpent slithering deeper into Belgium. But the roads, narrow, muddy, built for farmers, not fury, became a nightmare. Vehicles snarled together in endless traffic jams, engines idled for hours, devouring their limited fuel. What had been a river of steel began to slow, to choke, to bleed time and momentum. Malmedy, the turning point. Then came December 17th, and with it, the moment that would change everything. Near the crossroads at Bonnier, just outside Malmedy, elements of Peiper's column intercepted an American convoy from Battery B of the 208th 5th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. The skirmish was brief. The Americans surrendered, and then horror. The SS troops corralled approximately 120 American prisoners into a snowy field. Then, without warning, they opened fire with machine guns. Those not immediately killed fled in terror, only to be hunted down and executed. Wounded men were finished off with pistol shots to the head. When it ended, 84 American soldiers lay dead in the snow, unarmed, defenseless, murdered. Word of the Malmedy massacre spread like wildfire. Shock gave way to fury. Rage crystallized into resolve. Across the Ardennes, American soldiers who might have surrendered in the face of overwhelming odds now vowed to fight to the death. The battle had shifted. No longer just a military engagement, but a matter of vengeance. No quarter would be given. Manteuffel's thrust, hope in the center. Elsewhere, in the center, the picture was less grim for now. General Hasso von Manteuffel had argued for an attack without preliminary bombardment, banking on the sheer audacity of surprise. His gamble paid off. In the sector held by the inexperienced 106th Infantry Division, the German assault crashed through the lines like a hammer. 2 regiments, nearly 9,000 Americans, were encircled and captured over the coming days. It would mark the largest single surrender of U.S. forces in Europe. Now, the race for Bastogne and Saint-Vith began. These road junctions were the beating heart of the Ardennes logistics network. If they could be seized quickly, the German panzers could fan out, break into open country, and drive toward the Meuse unchecked. Oberst Meinrad von Lauchert, leading the 2nd Panzer Division, knew what was at stake. He drove his tanks forward with a recklessness bordering on madness, bypassing American resistance and leaving it for the infantry to mop up. On the maps at 5th Army Headquarters, the advance looked like a breakthrough. Some spearheads had pushed 20 miles into enemy territory. For a fleeting moment, it seemed the offensive might truly succeed. But in the turret of a Panther tank, Lieutenant Friedrich Rathke wasn't so sure. They had traveled 15 miles. Half the fuel was gone. Every bridge detour, every twist of the road through the thick Ardennes forest drank fuel greedily. And those forests, beautiful, silent, refused to allow cross-country movement. The tanks were locked to the roads, and the roads were treacherous. Rathke's company had rolled out with 22 tanks. Already, 3 had broken down, crippled by age, wear, and the chronic shortages of parts plaguing Germany's war machine. The tanks were still magnificent machines, but they were built for a Reich that no longer existed. And the promised fuel depots, still unseen, still just rumors whispered over idling engines. The spearhead was moving, but the clock was ticking, and fuel, more than bullets, more than bravery, was running out. Fuel for the fire, hope in the ashes. As Piper's panzers crawled deeper into Belgium's snowy wilderness, the hard truth became undeniable. The dream of captured fuel depots was exactly that, a dream. One by one, American supply points lay smoldering ruins, methodically torched by retreating troops. Flames consumed what the Germans so desperately needed. The cold arithmetic returned. At this pace, with what little they had, the tanks would sputter to a halt somewhere between Saint-Vith and the Meuse. And tanks without fuel were tombs of steel, perfect targets for Allied aircraft once the skies cleared. And on December 18th, the skies began to open. What had been Germany's greatest ally, dense fog, low clouds, grounding Allied air power, now betrayed them. Bit by bit, the overcast thinned. The heavens yawned wide, and down came the fury of American air superiority. Fighter bombers, like angry gods, rained death from above. Hauptmann Hans Schmidt, leading a company of Panzer Grenadiers, could do nothing but watch as P-47 Thunderbolts tore through the clouds. In mere seconds, 3 trucks and a half-track in his column were reduced to twisted wreckage. The attack came without warning. A dive, scream, rockets, cannon fire, then gone, lost in the overcast. German troops scrambled for cover, powerless. The Luftwaffe had promised air support, but almost none came. Most German fighters had been reserved for other operations, and in truth, many simply lacked the fuel to fly. With each passing hour, American aircraft grew bolder and more numerous. Every road seemed lined with burning vehicles. The offensive, already slowing, began to stall as units were forced to hide and wait. Precious fuel wasted in cold, idling engines. Collapse at La Glaise, at La Glaise. Kampfgruppe Peiper had ceased to be a threat. Encircled by American forces and out of fuel, Peiper now commanded a shattered remnant of his former power, less than 800 men and just 25 vehicles, all immobile. The once proud vanguard of the offensive was now a trapped garrison under constant artillery bombardment. American forces closed in from all sides. There would be no breakout, not on wheels. On December 22nd, the Luftwaffe attempted a desperate airdrop of fuel and ammunition. It failed spectacularly. Over 90% of the crates landed outside German lines, scattered across snow-covered fields where Americans retrieved them with ease. Peiper sent a request up the chain, permission to abandon the vehicles and escape on foot. The plea made its way to Dietrich, then to Hitler. The response came the next day, a command to hold. Reinforcements, it said, were on their way. But Peiper knew the truth. No reinforcements were coming. The roads were closed, the skies owned by the enemy. His men were out of rations. The wounded suffered in basements without morphine. So, on December 23rd, without orders, Peiper made the decision. That night, the survivors slipped into the dark forest, leaving behind tanks, guns, wounded, dead. Days later, the remnants reached German lines. Kampfgruppe Peiper had been annihilated, its mission failed, its power broken. Across the front, the story repeated. The tale at La Glaise echoed along the entire front. At St. Vith, American defenders clung on tenaciously, delaying German forces for 5 days. 5 days that the Wehrmacht could not afford. At Elsenborn Ridge, the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions held firm, creating a wall of resistance that funneled the 6th Panzer Army into narrow, deadly valleys. There, American artillery delivered slaughter on a scale not seen since the opening barrage. At Bastogne, a vital crossroads town, the story turned legendary. German forces encircled the town, expecting it to fall quickly. But the 101st Airborne Division had arrived just in time, transforming Bastogne into a fortress. On December 22nd, German General Lieutenant Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz sent an ultimatum demanding surrender. The American commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, replied with a single word: nuts. Perplexed, the Germans asked for clarification. The answer was simple: go to hell. The Americans held Bastogne through Christmas, enduring artillery, tank assaults, and encirclement. Montefeld tried to bypass the town and continue the advance, but without Bastogne's roads, no sustained movement westward was possible. Bastogne was the keystone of the Ardennes, and it held. The sky turns against the Reich. December 24th dawned in cruel clarity. For the first time in a week, the sun shone brightly over the Ardennes, a blessing for the Allies, a curse for the Germans. The weather the Wehrmacht had prayed would last instead betrayed them utterly. That day, Over 5,000 Allied sorties took to the air. Bombers and fighters poured down steel upon German supply lines, annihilated stalled convoys, and dropped desperately needed supplies into surrounded American positions. The air was alive with engines and the screams of rockets. Feldwebel Karl Meyer, commander of a Tiger tank unit, watched in seething frustration as P-47s destroyed his fuel convoy one truck at a time. Without fuel, his Tigers were immobile. Without ammunition, they were steel statues. American pilots, trained to strike where it hurt, hunted fuel trucks first, knowing that immobilized panzers could be finished off at leisure. Meyer's battalion had begun the offensive with 45 Tigers. By Christmas Eve, just 19 remained operational. The rest had been abandoned for want of fuel, destroyed in air raids, or lost in brutal close-quarter fighting. The Tiger, apex predator of German armor, armed with an 88mm gun that could destroy any Allied vehicle, was now prey. Because even the most fearsome beast is helpless when caged and starved. Christmas in the Crucible. December 25th, Christmas Day, marked the high water mark of the German offensive. Elements of the 2nd Panzer Division had reached within 4 miles of the Meuse near Dinant. It was the deepest penetration of the entire operation. But they were cut off, surrounded, and running on fumes. To the north, British tanks of XX Corps blocked the river crossings. To the south, General Patton had executed a masterstroke, disengaging his Third Army from Lorraine, pivoting it 90 degrees north, and smashing into the southern flank of the German salient. The weather now favored the Allies completely. Artillery observers called in strikes with pinpoint precision. Allied logistics, tireless and relentless, functioned with mechanical perfection. Thousands of tons of supplies flowed in daily. German supply convoys, when they moved at all, burned on snowy roads. The Bulge, the outward swell of German penetration into the Ardennes, had stretched as far as it could go. Now it was being crushed inward from all sides. Frozen realization. In a foxhole near Bastogne, Hauptmann Otto Krebs, who had led a Panzer Grenadier company since the first day of the offensive, sat staring into the snow. Christmas Day, his men huddled nearby, what few remained. He tried to make sense of what had happened. They had done everything right. They had caught the Americans off guard. They had broken through. They had advanced 30 miles in some sectors, yet they had failed. The Americans hadn't collapsed. They hadn't fled in panic. Instead, they had turned every town into a fortress, every crossroads into a death trap. Where the Wehrmacht expected retreat, they found resistance. Relentless, organized, savage resistance. Krebs' company had begun with 160 men. Now, only 48 could still fight. They had no mortar rounds left. Each rifle had barely enough bullets for one more clash. There would be no resupply. The roads were controlled by American air power. Their Christmas dinner was frozen bread and thin coffee. Around them, American artillery thundered a ceaseless rhythm of fire. The Americans had everything: fuel, food, shells, and skies full of aircraft. It seemed endless. Krebs had fought on the Eastern Front. He had seen the might of the Red Army, had watched German lines buckle under Soviet waves. That had been brutal. But this was different. This was precise, unrelenting, coordinated. Not a flood, but a machine. And the machine was crushing them. And so, as snow fell on a silent Ardennes forest, the truth settled like ice in his chest. They had gambled everything and lost. The last illusion shatters. Imagine watching your enemy move with mechanical precision. Infantry, armor, artillery, and aircraft, operating as if choreographed by the same invisible hand. For the exhausted German troops, the American war machine had become something terrifyingly efficient. Unlike the Soviets, who relied on mass and momentum, the Americans fought with seamless coordination, and while doing so, they kept their soldiers warm, well-fed, well-armed, and backed by a logistics network that seemed limitless. Every bullet, every ration, every shell arrived exactly when it was needed. Back at German headquarters, however, the fog of illusion was beginning to lift. Field Marshals Walter Model and Gerd von Rundstedt sent repeated requests to withdraw, to fall back before the American counterattacks could close in like a vice. But Hitler, cocooned in his delusions, refused. He demanded more. Victory, he insisted, was still within reach, if only his commanders would push harder. Relief at Bastogne. On December 26, a breakthrough. Patton's 4th Armored Division smashed through the German ring encircling Bastogne. A corridor was opened. Supplies and reinforcements surged in, transforming the battered garrison into a springboard for American counterattacks. What had once seemed a weak point in the line had become a dagger pointed at the German rear. Montefel, who had bypassed Bastogne believing it held only a token force, now found himself in a dire predicament. A reinforced fortress stood behind his lines, threatening his supply routes and cutting off avenues of retreat. The momentum of the offensive was now unraveling. From the rear, Operation Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe's last blow. Desperation breeds recklessness. On January 1st, 1945, the Luftwaffe launched its final large-scale operation of the war, Operation Bodenplatte. Over 900 aircraft surged toward Allied airfields in Belgium and the Netherlands in a surprise New Year's Day attack. For a few fleeting hours, it seemed the Luftwaffe could still deal a powerful blow. Roughly 200 Allied planes were destroyed on the ground, but the price was staggering. Nearly 280 German aircraft were lost. More than 230 pilots were killed, wounded, or captured. Many of them experienced veterans, squadron leaders, and irreplaceable aces. One of Germany's top fighter pilots, Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, watched in disbelief as the surviving aircraft limped home. The Luftwaffe had effectively destroyed itself and the Allies. They replaced their losses in days. Germany never would. From this moment on, the German army would fight beneath skies dominated by American and British fighter bombers, hunted like prey, with no one left to protect them from above. The offensive unravels. The German offensive had carved a bulge 60 miles deep and 40 miles wide, but it had failed to seize a single strategic objective. The Meuse River remained untouched. Antwerp lay far beyond reach. The Allied front had not been split, nor were their armies encircled. And Germany? Germany had burned its last strategic reserves, men, machines, and fuel, in one final blaze of hope. Every Panzer division thrown into the Ardennes was now crippled or destroyed. Replacement units didn't exist. New tanks could no longer be produced fast enough. Fuel was gone. Ammunition stockpiles had been drained. The resources poured into this operation had taken months to gather, and now they were gone forever. The beginning of the end. On January 3rd, the Allies counterattacked in force, launching pincer movements from both the north and south to close the Bulge and trap the remaining German forces inside. Only on January 8th did Hitler finally authorize a withdrawal. Far too late. German troops, now retreating under unrelenting pressure, fought bitter rearguard actions while American artillery and aircraft struck them day and night. Lieutenant Hans Weber of the 9th Panzer Division captured the collapse in a series of letters, never mailed, found among his belongings after his death in February 1945. We are destroying our own vehicles for lack of fuel. Every road is littered with abandoned machines. The Americans hunt us relentlessly, their artillery following us as if they can read our thoughts. We began this offensive believing we might alter the course of the war. Now we fight only to escape the trap we set for ourselves. The men no longer speak of victory, only of reaching the Siegfried Line alive. We have no more reserves, no more fuel, no more illusions. The Russians are coming from the east, the Americans and British from the west, and we have emptied ourselves in one final futile effort that gained nothing except to hasten our own destruction. By January 25th, the last German troops had been pushed back to their original positions. The Battle of the Bulge, Ardennes offensive, was over. The price of a delusion. The numbers tell the rest of the story and the scale of the disaster. Germany committed approximately 400,000 men to the offensive. Somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 Tars became casualties, wounded, missing, or killed. Around 12,000 Tars would never return home. The Wehrmacht lost 600 tanks and assault guns, vehicles that could no longer be replaced. Hundreds of aircraft were lost, along with their irreplaceable pilots. Fuel reserves were entirely consumed. Ammunition stockpiles were gone. Germany's ability to conduct major operations had been shattered. Never again would the Third Reich launch an attack of such scale. The Americans suffered, too. Approximately 81,000 casualties, including 19,000 dead. But the difference was stark. America could afford its losses. Ships arrived daily from across the Atlantic, carrying fresh divisions, new tanks, and endless supplies. The dead were mourned, but the war effort moved forward undiminished. Germany's losses, by contrast, were final. The strategic wound. Beyond the battlefield, the offensive had deeper costs. It delayed the Allied advance across the Rhine by roughly 6 weeks. But it also forced Hitler to redirect desperately needed reinforcements away from the Eastern Front, just as Stalin prepared to strike. On January 12, 1945, the Soviet Union launched the Vistula-Oder offensive. Germany, stripped of reserves by the Ardennes gamble, stood vulnerable. The Red Army advanced 300 miles in just 3 weeks, smashing through weakened German lines and reaching the Oder River, a mere 50 miles from Berlin. Hitler had bet everything on a knockout blow in the west, believing it would buy time and space in the east. Instead, he had drained his own lifeblood into the snow of the Ardennes and left the gates of Berlin unguarded. The Ardennes offensive had not just failed, it had broken the spine of Nazi Germany. Ashes in the snow, the final reckoning of the Ardennes. In another world, perhaps one where Germany had preserved its panzer divisions, the Soviet offensive might have met with stiffer resistance, slowed, if not stopped. But in this world, those armored formations lay shattered among the snow-laden forests of Belgium, silent witnesses to a grand illusion. Twisted metal, burned-out hulls, frozen corpses, these were not just battlefield remnants. They were monuments to the fantasy that had driven the Ardennes offensive. Oberst Hermann Gessner, who led a Volksgrenadier division during the campaign, poured his observations into a detailed after-action report. He never submitted it. By the time he finished writing, there was no command structure left to receive it. His conclusions cut deeper than any Allied bullet. The offensive failed because it was built on fantasy. We assumed total surprise and achieved it. We assumed bad weather and got a week of it. We assumed rapid advance, but our roads were mud paths for tractors, not tanks. We assumed we'd capture American fuel. They burned it. We assumed they'd break. They didn't. We assumed courage could replace logistics. That determination could stand in for artillery, and that belief could conquer air supremacy. Above all, we assumed that because Hitler ordered an offensive, that offensive must succeed. But this was not military planning. This was magical thinking, and it destroyed the last formations capable of defending the Reich. The war crimes and final defeats. The collapse had consequences far beyond the tactical. The 6th Panzer Army, bloodied but still nominally intact, was sent to Hungary for a final offensive near Lake Balaton in March 1945. There, it shattered completely against prepared Soviet defenses, ceasing to exist as an effective force. Its commander, Joseph Sepp Dietrich, survived the war. Tried at the Malmedy massacre tribunals, he received a life sentence, later reduced. He was released in 1955 and died in 1966, never once accepting responsibility for the atrocity committed by his men. Joachim Peiper, Dietrich's infamous subordinate and architect of the spearhead that had carved deep into Belgium, was also convicted for the Malmedy killings. His death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. He was released in 1956 and lived under an alias in France. In 1976, vengeance found him. His home was firebombed and he was killed, the ghosts of Bulge finally catching up with him 31 years after the massacre. Hasso von Manteuffel, the Wehrmacht's most capable panzer commander, was luckier. He surrendered to the British, served a brief prison sentence, and later entered West German politics. In post-war years, he coined the term Bundeswehr for the new German armed forces and even lectured at West Point. In the 1970s, Manteuffel reflected candidly on the offensive he once led. Militarily, the Ardennes made no sense. We couldn't reach Antwerp. We didn't have the fuel to reach the Meuse. We couldn't protect our columns from Allied air power. We had no reserves to exploit any breakthrough. Yes, we achieved tactical surprise and broke through the lines, but we couldn't sustain it. Even if we had reached Antwerp, which we could not, it would not have forced the Allies to negotiate. Germany was already finished. The Ardennes simply hastened the inevitable. A tactical triumph, a strategic illusion. The Battle of the Bulge revealed a cruel irony. German tactical excellence was undeniable. Soldiers fought with skill, tenacity, and discipline. Armored units executed complex maneuvers under extreme pressure. Tank crews won duels across frostbitten fields, yet none of it mattered. Because Germany, by this stage of the war, was hollowed out. It lacked the industrial base to replace its losses. It lacked fuel, spare parts, functioning railways. It lacked the strategic flexibility to respond to crisis. The Americans, shocked and wounded, nevertheless responded with breathtaking speed and strength. Within days of the initial breakthrough, Eisenhower had realigned divisions across hundreds of miles. Command structures shifted. Entire corps were repositioned. Allied logistics, undeterred by snow or cratered roads delivered thousands of tons of ammunition, fuel, food, and equipment daily. Every lost American tank was replaced, every destroyed truck substituted, every artillery shell replenished. The battlefield was strewn with evidence of German tactical brilliance and American logistical supremacy. The Battle of the Bulge was not won through superior battlefield skill. In many local engagements, German troops outperformed their adversaries. The battle was won through material endurance, through the ability to take hits, absorb losses, and keep fighting. Strategic collapse. After the Ardennes, Germany lost not only men and machines, it lost the initiative. The Wehrmacht, once feared for its blitzkrieg audacity, now fought only to delay, to hold back the inevitable. In the east, Soviet forces surged forward, relentless. In the west, the Allies ready to cross the Rhine. Strategic bombing crippled Germany's heartland. Oil fields were flattened, railways lay in ruins, factories stood silent. The industrial miracle that had fed 4 years of total war now sputtered and died. The German soldier no longer fought for victory, only for survival. They fought because surrender meant shame, imprisonment, or worse. They fought because they had been told surrender was treason and the regime still ruled by terror. They fought not for hope, but to delay the reckoning they knew was coming. The final toll. The Battle of the Bulge cost Germany dearly, approx. 100,000 casualties, including thousands killed. 600 tanks and assault guns destroyed. Irreplaceable losses. Fuel and ammunition reserves that had taken months to build, gone forever. The Luftwaffe suffered a final fatal blow. And in return, Germany achieved a 6-week delay in Allied operations at best. Crossing the Rhine was postponed from February to March 1945. That was all. For this, Germany sacrificed the last remnants of its armored strength, ensuring that when the Allies did cross, they encountered little more than skeletal resistance. Meanwhile, in the east, panzer divisions that might have slowed the Red Army were instead rusting in Belgian snowbanks. Fuel that could have powered a fighting withdrawal was incinerated in the Ardennes. The gamble, in every sense, was catastrophic, a self-inflicted wound from which there would be no recovery. The foot soldier's memory Gefreiter Paul Schmidt, who had stormed forward in the opening days of the offensive with the 12th Volksgrenadier Division, survived the war. In the 1960s, he recorded his memories, offering a glimpse into the transformation German soldiers underwent. We began with hope, even euphoria. Finally, we were attacking again. Finally, we would strike back at the Americans. And at first, it seemed real. We advanced. They retreated. We captured their supplies and equipment. But then, the resistance stiffened. Every village became a fortress, every road a kill zone. The sky opened and the aircraft came. We began to bleed, then to drown. Our hope turned to silence. We fought not for victory, but to survive the collapse we felt all around us. The Ardennes offensive was not just Germany's final attack, it was its final illusion. When it ended, so too did the last hope of altering the war's outcome. From that moment forward, it was no longer a question of if Germany would fall, but how soon. The last 4 days, from euphoria to despair. By the 4th day, illusions began to crack beneath the weight of reality. The early days of rapid advance and scattered American resistance faded quickly. The enemy stiffened. Artillery barrages intensified. Positions hard won in blood were lost again to counterattacks. And always, When the clouds broke, the aircraft came. Day after day, American fighter bombers hunted German columns like predators, circling wounded prey. They struck without warning, destroying fuel convoys, ammunition trucks, and the fragile threads that held the offensive together. Without supplies, the offensive lost its momentum. Without fuel, tanks became motionless hulks in the snow, waiting to be picked off from the air. By Christmas, it was no longer about victory. By New Year's, it was about survival. When the remnants of the attacking divisions finally withdrew in late January, there was almost nothing left of them. In many units, fewer than 1 in 3 men returned to German lines. The rest were dead, wounded, captured, or simply vanished. "We lost the war in the Ardennes," one veteran wrote bitterly, "not because the Americans defeated us, but because we defeated ourselves. We attacked with inadequate resources, with impossible objectives, guided by delusional planning, and 50,000 German soldiers paid the price for that fantasy." Not the army of 1940, the German army that surged into the Ardennes in December 1944 was not the force that had triumphed in France or stormed across the Soviet Union. It was a hollow echo of its former self. Many soldiers were boys. Teenagers rushed through a few weeks of basic training and handed outdated rifles. Others were men in their 40s, plucked from factories, offices, and homes to replace battlefield losses. Even the elite Waffen-SS divisions, once the spearhead of Germany's campaigns, had been diluted with young recruits lacking combat experience. Their equipment was a chaotic patchwork, a mix of obsolete weapons, captured material from defeated enemies, and overworked German vehicles barely held together by cannibalized parts. Logistics were failing. The transportation network, shattered by Allied bombing, struggled to move supplies. Rail lines were in ruins. Fuel was scarce. The Wehrmacht that attacked in the Ardennes was not an unstoppable juggernaut. It was a desperate, exhausted army, driven by ideological fantasy and the fading hope that maybe, just maybe, this last offensive could delay the end. Flickers of the past. Yet even in that broken force, remnants of past strength remained. German tactical doctrine still emphasized flexibility. At the company and battalion level, officers were empowered to make rapid decisions, to adapt, to exploit fleeting opportunities without awaiting orders. In the chaos of the Ardennes, this adaptability allowed some units to continue fighting effectively even when communication with higher command collapsed. Tank crews, especially in Panthers and Tigers, remained deadly. When fueled and armed, they could destroy Allied armor with terrifying precision. Infantry, when properly led and supplied, fought with grim determination even when surrounded or outnumbered, but none of that mattered, because Germany was now fighting a war it could not win, not against enemies whose factories ran day and night, whose supply ships crossed oceans unchallenged, whose aircraft controlled the skies. Tactical brilliance could not compensate for strategic bankruptcy. The strategic fantasy. The Ardennes offensive exposed the fatal flaw in Hitler's thinking. Since 1943, his strategy had rested on the belief that inflicting enough casualties would force the Allies to the negotiating table. He believed democracies were weak, that public opinion would collapse under pressure, that peace could be extracted through blood. He was wrong. When American positions were overrun in December, reinforcements came, not negotiations. When British tanks held the Meuse, London did not flinch. When Bastogne was surrounded, the 101st held, and Patton's army came to their rescue. The Allies understood what Hitler would not. Germany could no longer shape the war. The question was not whether it would fall, but when, and at what cost. The Ardennes added 100,000 German casualties to that final cost, but it changed nothing, except to ensure that unconditional surrender became not just policy, but moral necessity. No way out. The Malmedy massacre and others like it sealed Germany's fate. When Piper's SS troops murdered American prisoners, when Belgian civilians were gunned down, when the offensive was marked by systematic brutality, whatever sympathy remained in Allied hearts evaporated. There would be no conditional peace, no deals, no separate arrangements. Germany would be occupied completely. Its leadership would face trial. Justice would be rendered not on paper, but in the ruins of Berlin and the courtroom at Nuremberg. Total collapse. By February 1945, the Wehrmacht had retreated to the Siegfried Line, the final barrier inside Germany itself. But the situation was hopeless. To the east, Soviet forces had pushed to within 60 miles of Berlin. In the west, the Americans and British were preparing to cross the Rhine in overwhelming strength. German oil production had collapsed under the weight of Allied bombing. Synthetic fuel plants lay in ruins. Planes sat idle for lack of aviation fuel. Tanks sat dead in their revetments, unable to maneuver. The cities burned, hammered around the clock. Railways were wrecked. Roads impassable. The economy was disintegrating. Food was scarce. The Nazi regime, increasingly paranoid and tyrannical, ruled through terror. Soldiers were executed for voicing doubt. Civilians hanged for suspected defeatism. Germany had become a dystopia, a machine grinding itself into ash, unable to win, unwilling to surrender. The survivors, the men who returned from the Ardennes, carried more than frostbite and exhaustion. They carried the knowledge that Germany was finished. They had seen the truth, the limitless capacity of American industry, the merciless reach of Allied air power, the impossibility of inflicting more harm than the enemy could absorb. Some kept fighting, out of duty, fear, or indoctrination. Others fought for the man beside them, not for any idea. Many had been robbed of the ability to think independently, their will molded by years of Nazi propaganda. But none of them believed in victory anymore. The final verdict, the Battle of the Bulge, cost Germany approximately 100,000 casualties. It consumed the last operational panzer divisions. It drained the final reserves of fuel and ammunition. In exchange, Germany delayed the Allied crossing of the Rhine by 6 weeks. That was the full price of the Ardennes offensive. It left Germany crippled in the west and exposed in the east. It sacrificed precious armored units that might have slowed the Soviets. It squandered fuel that might have powered an orderly retreat. It achieved nothing of strategic value, and everything it consumed was irreplaceable. It was Hitler's final gamble, and it bought nothing but death. The snow-covered fields of the Ardennes became the graveyard of Germany's last hope, not because the Allies were unbeatable, but because Germany had nothing left to fight with except fantasy, fear, and the fading echoes of a past it could no longer sustain. The final failure, where hope died. By February 1945, even among the ranks of the most hardened soldiers, belief in victory had withered. The Battle of the Bulge, Germany's final offensive gamble, had ended not in triumph, but in retreat. From that moment on, there would be no more attacks, no more last-minute surprises. The Wehrmacht would only fight to hold ground, to delay, to resist the unstoppable advance of enemies on all fronts. And though the war would grind on for 3 more months, the outcome was already written in blood and steel. Germany would fall, its cities would burn, the Nazi regime would be swept into the ashes of history. And millions more, soldiers and civilians alike, would die in a doomed attempt to delay what could no longer be stopped. A story of delusion and denial. The Ardennes, viewed through German eyes, is not a tale of glorious last stands or noble sacrifice. It is a tragedy of self-deception. It is a story of men sent to do the impossible by leaders who refuse to confront reality. A story of tactical skill and battlefield courage squandered on an objective that could never be achieved. From the beginning, the offensive was rooted in fantasy. German soldiers fought with skill and ferocity. They achieved surprise. They broke through American lines and pushed deep into Belgian territory. They inflicted serious losses. But none of it mattered because the foundation was flawed. Germany could no longer win the war, not through one more push, not through surprise, not through audacity. The strategic calculus had turned against them long ago. The Allies could absorb the blow. Germany could not afford the cost. The true cost of illusion. The final reckoning was merciless. 100,000 German casualties, dead, wounded, missing. 600 tanks and assault guns, machines that could no longer be built. Hundreds of aircraft, along with irreplaceable pilots. Fuel and ammunition that had taken months to accumulate, consumed in 5 bitter weeks. And what was gained in return? 6 weeks of delay. No cities captured, no armies encircled, no strategic objectives reached. Germany had traded the last of its reserves for time it could not use, and in doing so, had guaranteed its own destruction. The death of an illusion. But this failure was more than a military setback. It was a psychological collapse. The death of the final German illusion. The illusion that the war could still be won. That courage, sacrifice, and willpower alone might overcome the weight of Allied industry and air dominance. After the Ardennes, even the most fanatical Nazi could no longer cling to that belief. The Wehrmacht had thrown everything it had left into one final blow, and it had bounced off the armored wall of Allied logistics. The best soldiers, the last tanks, the final drops of fuel, all consumed in a battle that could never change the outcome. The offensive didn't delay Germany's defeat. It accelerated it. A battle fought for survival. That secured destruction. The German soldiers who bled in the snow of the Ardennes believed they were fighting for their country's survival. They believed, many of them, that they were defending their families, their homeland, their future. But what they were truly fighting for was a regime that preferred total ruin over concession, a regime that had long since abandoned rational strategy for blind ideology, a regime that could not win and would not surrender. Those soldiers, no matter how brave, were not rescuing Germany from destruction. They were ensuring it, because the Ardennes consumed the last formations that might have delayed the Allied advance across the Rhine. It sacrificed the panzer divisions that might have contested the Red Army's push toward Berlin. It burned the fuel that might have powered a fighting withdrawal. It erased any chance, however slim, of negotiating for peace. The war's final equation. In the end, the Battle of the Bulge proved a brutal truth. War is not won by will alone. It is won by factories, by fuel, by food, by railways that run. By skies filled with your aircraft, not the enemy's. Germany had none of those. The Allies had all of them. From December 16, 1944, when the first artillery barrage echoed through the frozen Ardennes, to January 25, 1945, when the last German units limped back to their lines, the Reich fought a battle it could not win, purchased a delay it could not use, and paid with resources it could never replace. In seeking to prevent defeat, Germany ensured it. The Battle of the Bulge was not merely Germany's last offensive, it was its final failure, a moment when courage could not compensate for cold arithmetics, when audacity was drowned in Allied steel, and when history closed its hand around the fate of a nation that had run out of time, out of options, and out of hope.